Most people think cemeteries are peaceful at night. Thomas knew better. He'd been the groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery for 8 years, and he'd learned that darkness brought different kinds of visitors. Some came to grieve, some came to remember, and some came to steal. What the grave robbers digging into the Morrison family crypt didn't know was that the quiet man watching them from behind the maintenance shed had spent 15 years in places where disturbing the dead was the least of anyone's worries. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this gripping story of sacred ground and deadly consequences, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Riverside Cemetery sprawled across 47 acres of rolling hills on the outskirts of town, its weathered headstones and ancient oak trees creating a landscape that spoke of centuries of final rest. During the day, it was a place of quiet beauty, where families came to honor their departed and tourists admired the elaborate Victorian monuments. But at night, when the gates were locked and the last visitor had gone home, it became something different entirely. Thomas Park had been the night groundskeeper for 8 years, living in a small cottage at the center of the property where he could keep watch over the dead who'd been entrusted to his care. At 52, he moved with the careful economy of a man who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. His gray hair was always neatly trimmed, his work clothes clean but practical, and his manner so unremarkable that most people forgot him the moment they looked away. During the day, he maintained the grounds with methodical precision, trimming grass, cleaning headstones, repairing damaged fencing, and ensuring that every grave received the care and respect it deserved. The work was solitary, meditative, and gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. What visitors didn't know was that Thomas Park wasn't just any groundskeeper. They didn't know that his slight limp was from an IED explosion outside Kandahar that had killed 3 members of his patrol and left him with shrapnel that still set off metal detectors. They didn't know that his habit of positioning himself where he could see all approaches was muscle memory from 15 years of military service in places where relaxing your guard meant death. And they definitely didn't know that Master Sergeant Thomas Michael Park, retired 75th Ranger Regiment, had spent 3 deployments protecting sacred sites and burial grounds in Afghanistan and Iraq, where desecrating the dead was considered one of the most serious offenses possible. Thomas had chosen this job specifically because it reminded him of his time overseas, the responsibility of protecting those who could no longer protect themselves, the honor of standing guard over sacred ground. For 8 years, Riverside Cemetery had been his sanctuary, his chance to serve without violence, his opportunity to find peace among the peaceful dead. But Thomas had also learned that peace was something you had to be prepared to fight for. The Morrison family crypt was the largest and most elaborate tomb in Riverside Cemetery, a granite monument to railroad wealth that had been built in 1897 and stood like a small fortress among the more modest graves surrounding it. Local legend held that old Edmund Morrison, the railroad baron who'd founded half the businesses in town, had been buried with a fortune in gold coins and jewelry, enough wealth to make grave robbing worth the considerable risks involved. Marcus Digger Thompson had been planning this job for 6 months, studying the cemetery's layout, learning the groundskeeper's routines, and assembling a team he could trust. At 38, Digger had been in the grave robbing business for over a decade, specializing in historic cemeteries where wealthy families had buried their dead with valuable possessions. His partners were Billy Hernandez, 26, with a talent for bypassing security systems and a desperate need for quick money, and Jake Morrison, no relation to the family they were planning to rob. Jake was the muscle, a former construction worker who could move heavy stone slabs and wasn't squeamish about working around corpses. They'd done their homework carefully. The cemetery's security was basic, motion sensors at the gates, but nothing protecting the interior grounds. The groundskeeper appeared to be a harmless old man who went to bed early and slept soundly. The nearest police patrol was over 20 minutes away, and the Morrison crypt was hidden from the road by a grove of oak trees. What they hadn't researched was the specific background of the man they'd dismissed as a harmless old groundskeeper. Public records listed Thomas Park as a former military member receiving disability benefits, but his service record was partially classified and his medical files were sealed. They'd observed him for weeks and seen exactly what he'd wanted them to see: a quiet, solitary man who posed no threat to their operation. They'd been planning this for months, but they'd never really understood who they were planning it against. At 2:17 a.m. on a moonless Tuesday night in October, three figures slipped through a gap in Riverside Cemetery's perimeter fence, moving with the practiced silence of men who'd done this kind of work before. They carried minimal but essential equipment: shovels, pry bars, a small electric winch, and headlamps that cast narrow beams of light across the weathered headstones. The Morrison crypt stood at the cemetery's highest point, surrounded by decorative wrought iron fencing that was more aesthetic than protective. The tomb was built from massive granite blocks, with an ornate bronze door that had been sealed shut for over a century. Thomas heard them long before he saw them. 8 years of living in the cemetery had taught him to distinguish between the normal sounds of night, wind through the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, and the irregular noises that meant human intrusion. The soft clink of metal tools, muffled footsteps of men trying to move quietly, whispered conversations of people who thought they were alone. He'd been expecting this for months. The Morrison crypt had been attracting attention lately. Strangers asking questions about the cemetery's history, local kids daring each other to touch the tomb, urban explorers posting photos online that inevitably led to speculation about the treasures supposedly buried inside. Thomas had increased his security patrols and made note of suspicious visitors, but he'd known it was only a matter of time. From his cottage window, Thomas could see the flashlight beams moving across the hillside toward the Morrison tomb. 3 men, moving with confidence that suggested experience, carrying equipment that meant they were serious about whatever they planned to do. He watched them for several minutes, noting their approach route, their equipment, and their positioning around the crypt. Then, he reached into his closet and retrieved items he hadn't touched in over 2 years. The tactical gear still fit perfectly: black BDUs, combat boots, load-bearing vest with night vision goggles. Thomas dressed in darkness, muscle memory guiding his hands through preparations he'd made hundreds of times in far more dangerous circumstances. The M4 carbine he retrieved from its locked case was perfectly maintained. Thomas had hoped he'd never need these things again. But as he watched the 3 men setting up equipment around the Morrison crypt, he realized that some responsibilities transcended personal preferences. Moving through Riverside Cemetery at night was different when you were hunting rather than patrolling. Thomas knew every path, every hiding spot, every angle that would keep him invisible until he chose to reveal himself. The grave robbers were so focused on their work, they never noticed the shadow moving through the oak trees. The men had removed the decorative bronze grating and were working on the granite slab covering the entrance. Their electric winch was powerful but noisy. Billy monitored equipment while Jake operated the winch. Digger directed the operation, consulting architectural drawings by flashlight. Thomas observed them for 20 minutes, learning their roles, security procedures, and professionalism. These weren't desperate amateurs. They moved with coordination of an experienced team. But they'd made a critical error. They'd assumed violating this sacred ground would go unopposed. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. Thomas stepped out from behind the oak tree at 2:43 a.m., his night vision goggles giving him clear view of the 3 men illuminated by their own flashlights. He'd positioned himself uphill, giving him both tactical advantage and symbolic authority. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silence, "I think you may be in the wrong place." All 3 men froze, their lights swinging toward his voice. Thomas remained motionless, knowing their night-adjusted eyes would see only a dark silhouette. "Jesus Christ," Billy whispered, panic in his voice. "Where did he come from?" Digger recovered first, trying to take control. "Easy there, old man. This is just a misunderstanding. We're researchers, genealogy work." At 2:43 a.m., Thomas replied calmly, "with industrial equipment in a locked cemetery." "Look, we don't want trouble," Jake said, his hand moving toward his jacket. "Why don't you head back to your house and pretend you didn't see anything?" That's when Thomas stepped into their flashlight beams. The harmless old groundskeeper had been replaced by someone else entirely. A figure in full tactical gear, night vision goggles, body armor, carrying an assault rifle with easy familiarity. "I am Master Sergeant Thomas Park, United States Army Rangers, retired," he said with command authority. This is sacred ground, and you are desecrating it. You have 30 seconds to gather your equipment and leave." The transformation was so complete that all three men stood frozen. The quiet groundskeeper had disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated controlled lethality. "Holy shit," Billy breathed. "He's military." "Was military," Digger corrected, but his voice lacked confidence. "Look, soldier boy, there's 3 of us and 1 of you." Thomas's response was immediate. "I spent 3 tours protecting burial grounds in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've dealt with grave robbers and people who thought the dead couldn't fight back. You will leave here tonight, one way or another." What happened next was less a fight than a demonstration. Thomas had spent 15 years learning how to neutralize multiple opponents without lethal force, how to control situations through superior positioning and overwhelming psychological pressure. Jake made the mistake of reaching for the pistol in his jacket. He found himself face down on grass with his arm twisted behind his back before he'd cleared leather, Thomas's knee pressing against his spine with calibrated pressure. "Weapons on the ground," Thomas commanded. "All of them, now." Billy immediately complied, dropping a small pistol and stepping back with hands raised. Digger hesitated, then slowly removed a larger handgun, placing it on the granite slab. "Smart choice," Thomas said, releasing Jake and stepping back to watch all 3 men simultaneously. "Now, you're going to restore this site to exactly the condition it was in when you arrived. Then, you're going to leave and never come back." "And if we don't?" Digger asked. Thomas smiled without humor. "Then I stop treating this as a civil matter and start treating it as a military operation. And trust me, you don't want to see how I handled grave robbers in Afghanistan." The 3 men exchanged glances, realizing their night had gone from profitable to potentially fatal. They'd expected an elderly security guard, not someone who'd spent years dealing with people exactly like them in places where rules of engagement were more flexible. "You can't just threaten people," Billy said weakly. "There are laws." "You're right," Thomas agreed. "There are laws against desecrating graves, breaking and entering, and carrying concealed weapons without permits. Should we discuss how those laws affect your situation?" It took 45 minutes for the 3 men to restore the Morrison crypt to its original condition, working under Thomas's supervision. They replaced the bronze grating, repositioned the granite elements, and cleaned up every trace of their attempted break-in. "The grass," Thomas said, pointing to equipment impressions. "Fluff it up, make it look natural." While they worked, Thomas radioed the county sheriff's office, reporting successful intervention of attempted grave robbery and requesting pickup of 3 suspects. He'd zip-tied their hands using restraints he'd carried for 8 years without expecting to need them. "We never would have bothered if we'd known you were special forces," Digger said as they waited for police. "That's exactly why I don't advertise my background," Thomas replied. "Most people don't need to know. But some people, when they cross certain lines, need to be reminded that there are still guardians standing watch." "Guardians of what?" Jake asked. "These people are already dead." Thomas looked out across the moonlit headstones. "That's exactly the point. They can't protect themselves anymore. They can't fight back when people try to rob them, disturb them, disrespect them. So someone has to stand guard." He turned back to them. "For 8 years, that someone has been me. And as long as I'm here, it always will be." The sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes later to find 3 subdued grave robbers and a groundskeeper who'd returned to civilian clothes and quiet demeanor. Deputy Martinez had known Thomas for 6 years as nothing but the polite, unremarkable man who kept the cemetery in perfect condition. "Mr. Park," she said, "you handled this very professionally." "Military training," Thomas replied with his modest smile. "Old habits." "Must have been some training," Deputy Martinez observed, looking at the career criminals being loaded into patrol cars. "Breaking up their operation probably saved a lot of other cemeteries." Thomas nodded, accepting thanks with quiet dignity. "Just doing my job." After police left, Thomas walked around the Morrison crypt, checking for damage, ensuring the site was properly restored. The bronze fittings gleamed in moonlight, granite stones stood in perfect alignment, surrounding grass showed no signs of disturbance. He stood there for a long moment, looking across the cemetery he'd called home for 8 years. Tomorrow, families would visit their departed loved ones, finding the same peaceful sanctuary they'd always known. They would never know how close they'd come to having that sanctuary violated, or who had stood guard to protect it. 3 months later, Thomas received a letter from the County Historical Society thanking him for preventing desecration of a significant historical site. The Morrison crypt had been designated as a protected landmark with enhanced security funded by county commissioners. The 3 grave robbers had pled guilty and were serving 3 to 7 years. Their arrest broke up a network targeting historic cemeteries across 3 states, bringing peace of mind to dozens of communities. Word spread quietly through the local community. Visitors began treating Thomas with different respect, not just as the man who kept resting places beautiful, but as someone who would protect them from harm. Local veterans stopped by to shake his hand and share stories. Thomas answered questions politely but briefly. Just military training remained his standard response. But late at night, walking rounds through the moonlit cemetery, Thomas sometimes found himself standing straighter, moving with more purpose, remembering there was honor in being a guardian of sacred ground. The dead couldn't protect themselves, but they didn't have to. As long as Thomas Park was groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery, they would never be defenseless. Some men retire and seek peace. Others find that peace comes from being ready for war, even in the quietest places. Thomas had spent 8 years learning to find serenity among headstones and flowers. Now he understood that true serenity came from being prepared to defend what mattered most, when it mattered most. He turned off his flashlight and headed back to his cottage, ready for another quiet night of standing watch over sacred ground. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary, quiet, perhaps even invisible, only to discover they were protecting something sacred, something important, something that mattered more than their own comfort? Share their story in the comments. Tell us what city you're watching from. And if you think stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet guardians who stand watch in places we never think to look. Because at the Human Stories, we believe that the most important protection often comes from the most unexpected protectors. Sometimes the guardian of sacred ground wears a uniform and carries a rifle. Sometimes he wears work clothes and carries a rake. But he's always ready when it matters most. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.